One of the things that's always attracted me to the horror genre is that it's assaultive. The horror genre is not trying to make you think, at least not during the experience. I think that when I go to see a good horror movie, I'm just experiencing. I'm all about the experience. Or when I'm writing a story that I want to scare readers, I'm all about that experience. But I think that if it's really good, there should be something to think about later on.
One of the most famous American authors of our generation, Stephen King has rightfully developed a reputation of being a master of horror, science fiction, and fantasy. He has sold more than 350 million copies of his books, which include 50 novels and a compilation of nearly 200 short stories. Much of King's work has crossed over and been adapted into theatrical and TV movies, but King's work actually accomplished something quite remarkable with his horror films. He's created his own unique subgenre within the horror genre. When you talk about a movie like Salem's Lot, you don't describe it as a vampire movie. No, you describe it as a Stephen King movie. So in this video, I will be diving into this unique subgenre of horror movies and counting down my personal top 10 films. So let's dive in and start with my number 10 Stephen King horror movie.
Forget it, Arnie. This baby's got 93,000 miles on it. Probably 193.
I don't care.
Bet it won't even start.
She'll start. You need these.
Now I'll be the first to admit, at face value, the idea of an evil car that's alive, driving around killing people, is a pretty stupid premise. But when you have a legendary horror director John Carpenter behind the wheel, it delivers one hell of a ride. Based on the Stephen King novel of the same name, Christine tells the story of a dorky teenager named Arnie who is the prime target for bullies. One day, Arnie purchases a Plymouth Fury, aka Christine, which he begins to restore at a local garage. Arnie quickly develops an obsession with Christine, as the car itself seems to be alive and developing an obsession with Arnie as well. The more time Arnie spends with Christine, his personality slowly begins to change from a harmless nerd into a sinister greaser. And soon enough, Christine is out on the loose hunting down hers and Arnie's enemies. Now, one of the things I find brilliant about this movie is how the line between Arnie and Christine becomes very blurred. You don't know where the character Arnie ends and where Christine begins, or, from a different perspective, where the character of Christine ends and where Arnie begins. For instance, when Christine is out killing people, all her windows become tinted, forcing the audience to interpret for themselves whether or not Arnie is physically behind the wheel controlling Christine, or if it's the car acting on its own. Either way, Christine delivers one thrilling ride.
Comic book. What? It's a comic book. What? It's a comic book. It's a comic book. My kids love these things.
With a tagline that claims, "It'll be the most fun you'll ever have being scared," Creepshow is an original screenplay written by King that pays homage to the 1950s EC comics like Tales from the Crypt and The Vault of Horror. When an angry father discovers that his kid, who is played by Stephen King's real-life son, is reading a horror comic book called Creepshow, he punishes his kid and throws out the comic. We then dive into the 5 separate tales that are found within the comic book's pages. Now, these stories range in some really bizarre plots. A murdered father rises from the grave to kill his family because he wants cake. A hick touches a meteor that crashed on his property and begins growing into a giant weed. 2 lovers being buried up to their necks by a vengeful husband that wants them to drown by the tide. A professor receives a mysterious crate that happens to have a monster in it. And finally, an isolated man battles an army of cockroaches. The thing that's great about this movie is that it delivers a nice balance between humor and horror with each of its tales. Director George A. Romero, who is most famous for his Night of the Living Dead series, does a terrific job with the visual look of this movie. It really feels like you are watching an actual 1950s comic book. And with a surprising cast that includes Ed Harris, Ted Danson, and Leslie Nielsen, Creepshow does deliver what it promises, a very fun ride.
If there is any word of comfort I can give you, it's just this, that the face of the beast always becomes known, and the time of the beast always passes.
A heartwarming yet terrifying movie, Silver Bullet is based off the King book entitled Cycle of the Werewolf. It follows a 13-year-old cripple boy named Marty as the small town he lives in is being terrorized by a mad killer. Marty, however, uncovers the truth behind the killings as he learns that it's the work of a werewolf on the loose. Fearing for his life, Marty turns to the only two people that will believe his story, his sister and his uncle. So now, it's up to all three to uncover who in town is the werewolf before it's too late. The performances of Corey Haim as Marty and Gary Busey of all people as the uncle are both surprisingly well done, and the werewolf sequences are absolutely terrifying, especially during the scene when the vigilantes are hunting down the killer in the forest when it's all foggy. That is a creepy scene. Definitely worth checking out during the next full moon.
General manager claims that the phantom in room interferes.
I have never used the word phantom.
Oh, I'm sorry. Spirit, specter?
No, you misunderstand. Whatever's in 1408 is nothing like that.
Then what is it?
It's an evil fucking room.
Exploring more of the psychological side of horror, 1408 is based off the short story found in the Everything's Eventual book. It follows an author named Mike Enslin who makes a living traveling to various supposed haunted locations to investigate and write about them. Although, he himself has become a non-believer in the supernatural, for he has never seen an actual ghost during his travels. One day, Mike receives an anonymous postcard warning him not to enter the room 1408 at a hotel called the Dolphin in New York. Mike's curiosity becomes piqued and travels to New York to check into 1408. However, the hotel manager, who is played by Samuel L. Jackson, tries to persuade Mike not to check into the room, as he informs him that 56 people have died in the room, with none of them surviving more than an hour of entering. Mike of course ignores the warnings and enters 1408, where for the next hour, Mike must fight for his own sanity as the room tries to drive him crazy to make him commit suicide. Now story-wise, having a character locked in a room alone for an hour is a very risky thing to do, for they have become very limited into what the character can do to grow and advance the story. But 1408 pulls it off by delivering some very creepy scares and having John Cusack give a great performance that he has to carry all on his own by talking to himself through a tape recorder to give us a window into his mind as he battles his own personal demons.
Praise God! Praise the Lord! A time of tribulation has come. A test is at hand. The final test.
A movie that has received very poor reviews from professional critics, but I feel to be very underrated, especially when you compare it to its 2009 remake. The original Children of the Corn is based off the short story found in the Night Shift book. It follows the characters Bert and Vicky as they drive to Seattle, Washington for Bert's new job. While driving through Nebraska and conveniently having a copy of the Night Shift book on the dashboard of their car, the couple gets sidetracked from their journey to a town called Gatlin that has been taken over by a cult of children who previously murdered their own parents and all of the remaining adults in town. Led by the cult leader Isaac and his main enforcer Malachi, the kids kidnap Vicky and want to sacrifice her to an evil entity which the children call He Who Walks Behind the Rose. So Bert must now rescue his girlfriend from the cult and escape with their lives. Now, as I mentioned before, back in 2009, there was a remake of this film that was made as a TV movie. Even though the remake follows the original King story a lot more closely, I still prefer the original. Take for instance the characters of Bert and Vicky. In the remake, these are some of the most unlikable, annoying characters I've ever watched. You'll spend your time with this movie wishing that they would just hurry up and die. Whereas in the original, Bert and Vicky are pretty likable people, and you root for them to make it to the end and survive. But when it comes to the character of Malachi, I feel that the remake did the better job. They added a level of depth to him that shows that he is a very loyal and dedicated character that believes religion is the most important thing in his life. And at the end, you actually feel sorry for this character. Now don't get me wrong, the original Malachi is a badass character, but he is pretty flat. He's just a power-hungry person that whines and yells a lot. Now with Isaac, I'm actually 50-50 with him. I love how in the remake, Isaac as a character is more hands-on and goes out into the city streets with the kids to kill, acting like a general, but the performance of this 8-year-old kid is terrible. There wasn't a single second where I believed that this kid was a God-chosen prophet that could actually lead a killer cult of kids. Whereas in the original, Isaac was played by a 25-year-old actor that just so happened to look like a 12-year-old boy. He delivered a performance that brings such a strong, commanding evil quality to Isaac, while at the same time convincing me that he was a 12-year-old boy.
Mr. Crandall, there's a path over there. Do you know where it goes?
Oh. Yeah? That's a good story. A good walk. I'll take you up there sometime. Tell you the story, too.
Stephen King once said that the only novel he wrote that really scared him was Pet Sematary. The movie follows a man named Dr. Lewis Creed as he and his family have just moved from the city of Chicago to a small town in Maine. They are kindly greeted by the neighbor Judd Crandall, who takes them on a tour down a path located by the Creed's new home that leads to a local pet cemetery. Later, Lewis is visited by a ghost named Pascal, who was a patient that Lewis tried to save previously. Pascal takes Lewis to the cemetery and warns him not to go beyond this point, no matter how much he feels he needs to. Lewis will soon ignore Pascal's warnings as the family cat dies, and Lewis and Mr. Crandall take the cat beyond the pet cemetery and bury it in an Indian burial ground. The cat comes back to life and finds its way back to the Creed's home, where it begins to act strangely and very aggressively. Months later, the Creeds experience a tragedy as their baby boy wanders onto the road and is run over by a truck. Overcome with despair, Lewis digs up his own son out of his grave and reburies him at the burial ground, so he can hopefully be reunited with his son. But when Gage comes back to life, the real nightmare begins. Now there is quite a few things that are left unexplained in this movie that gives a clear reason as to how and why some things happen in this story. But I think that is one of the movie's strengths, because the characters themselves don't fully understand it either, which makes it even more scarier for the characters and the audience as well. And I've got to say, when it comes to scares, this movie really makes its mark with the 2-year-old Gage. This kid will completely freak you out and will have you literally jumping out of your seat. If anything, just watch the last 30 minutes of this movie, and I guarantee you'll be on the brink of having a heart attack.
Telekinesis, thought to be the ability to move or to cause changes in objects by force of the mind.
Based on the very first novel that Stephen King ever published, actress Sissy Spacek plays Carrie White, who is a very shy and sheltered student in high school that is the victim of various pranks and jokes pulled by her fellow classmates. Carrie also lives a rough life at home, as she is ruled by her overbearing and highly religious mother, Margaret. One day, while showering after gym class, Carrie experiences her first period. But due to Carrie's sheltered life forced upon by her mother, Carrie doesn't know what a period is. So when she sees the blood, she completely freaks out thinking she is dying. She runs into the locker room for help, But all the girls just make fun of her and proceed to throw tampons at her, while Carrie just cowers in a corner absolutely terrified, still thinking she is going to die. The gym teacher punishes the girls for this horrific scene by keeping them after school to do very intense gym workouts. But a spoiled slut named Chris Hargensen vows revenge on Carrie for getting her in trouble. So she carries out a plan to get Carrie to win the crown at the prom and then proceed to dump gallons of pig's blood on her. But what she, nor did anyone at the prom ever suspect, is that Carrie possesses the power of telekinesis, and that she is about to have a psychotic break. Now, if you're a fan of director Brian De Palma, you know his work is very influenced by Alfred Hitchcock, and De Palma does bring these influences to this film as well, particularly from the movie Psycho. For instance, the name of the school that Carrie goes to is called Bates High School, named after the character Norman Bates. Coincidentally, both Norman Bates and Carrie White share stories where they are ruled by an overbearing mother. And to take it a step further, do you recognize the violin music cue that is always played whenever Carrie uses her powers?
Creepy Carrie! Creepy Carrie!
Yep, bears a striking resemblance to the violins in the shower scene from Psycho, doesn't it? But where De Palma really shines is the prom scene. He does an absolutely amazing job sucking the audience into the madness of this massacre by using some very stylish split-screen action as Carrie goes all Jean Grey Dark Phoenix on everyone's ass. Now, for those who are curious, Carrie was followed by a sequel called The Rage, and was remade as a television movie, but I don't really recommend them. But next spring, they are coming out with a theatrical remake, so we'll just have to wait and see how that one is.
I never meant for it to become my life. And if I hadn't gotten rid of it now, I'd have ended up writing it forever.
Now I'm leaving for Colorado to try to finish the new book.
If I can make this work, I might just have something I want on my tombstone.
A movie I think any novelist will find to be their worst nightmare, Misery comes from the book of the same name that follows a best-selling author named Paul Sheldon, who has become famous for writing a series of books that centers around a character named Misery. However, Sheldon has grown tired of writing this series and travels to Colorado to write a new story. After completing the novel, Sheldon gets caught up in a blizzard and crashes his car. Sheldon awakes to find that he has been rescued by a nurse named Annie Wilkes and has been brought to her home to recover until the roads can be cleared. At first, Annie seems to be a very nice lady and tells Sheldon that she is his #1 fan and can't wait to read the new Misery book. But when Annie finds out that Sheldon has killed off the Misery character, her whole world crashes, and we see how far an obsessed fan will go to keep her favorite series alive. Now, just like 1408, this movie takes a huge risk and puts a lot of its faith into its cast, as most of this movie takes place in a single room that the two characters interact in. So this movie very heavily relies on performance and dialogue to create character development. Luckily, actress Kathy Bates delivers an Oscar-winning performance as Annie Wilkes, where we first see this character as a very corny but sweet little lady, then slowly peels away the layers of this character like an onion until we reach the rotting core that exposes what a psychopathic lunatic Annie really is. Misery creates a sense of claustrophobia and keeps its high level of suspense throughout the movie, while throwing in a couple of laughs and as well as some very disturbing scenes. It's a very well-rounded and gripping film.
Hi, Georgie. Aren't you going to say hello?
One of the most terrifying programs I saw on television as a kid, It is a two-part made-for-TV movie that is based off the novel of the same name. Part 1 mostly takes place in the 1960s, as a small town in Maine is being plagued by a series of unexplained murders. One by one, we are introduced to a group of 7 kids, as each of them are being stalked by a monster that can take the form of whatever the particular kid is afraid of, but most of the time it takes the form of a clown that calls itself Pennywise the Dancing Clown. The 7 kids all come together and form a unique and special bond as they confess to each other that they have all seen and have been terrorized by this monster. They eventually learn that the monster lives under the town in the sewers, so they travel down there to make their stand. This leads to a very epic showdown that is very exciting and horrific at the same time. When the kids return to the surface, each of them take a pledge that if it should ever return, they would all come back. Fast forward 30 years later, Part 2 continues the story as our main characters are now adults and have all received word that unexplained murders have started back up in their hometown. Making good on their promise, 6 of the 7 characters drop everything that's going on in their current lives to reunite with their old friends as they relive their childhood nightmares and battle against Pennywise once again. Now, when I first saw this movie back when it aired in 1990, I was about to turn 8 years old. I had no idea what it was about, but I did know it was a Stephen King story, so I knew it was going to be a scary movie. Little did I know was how traumatizing this movie was going to be for a 7-year-old. Back then, there was nothing like this on television, especially during prime time. I can only imagine how many unsuspecting kids watched this and developed a fear of clowns afterwards. It really made its mark back in the day.
Physically, it's not a very demanding job. The only thing that can get a bit trying up here during the winter is the tremendous sense of isolation.
Well, that just happens to be exactly what I'm looking for. I'm outlining a new writing project, and 5 months of peace is just what I want.
Ironically, the #1 pick on my list is the movie that Stephen King himself seems to be the most outspoken about on how much he dislikes this adaptation that comes from his own novel. But in my view, director Stanley Kubrick took what Stephen King did and turned it into a masterpiece. The story is about a writer named Jack Torrance as he takes a job being a caretaker at an isolated hotel called the Overlook during its closed winter season. He's accompanied by his wife Wendy and his son Danny as they spend the winter months living in the hotel to maintain it. However, the son Danny possesses a psychic ability which is called shining that lets him see things from the past and future, as well as various ghosts that are living in the hotel. These ghosts and spirits start influencing Jack as he begins to slip into madness and plans to murder his family. Like Kathy Bates in Misery, Jack Nicholson gives a terrifying performance where we slowly watch his character turn from a loving father into an axe-wielding maniac. While at the same time, Kubrick exposes the audience to some very unsettling yet memorable imagery. Who could forget things like the blood pouring out of the elevator, or the 2 twins standing at the end of the hall? The pages that Jack typed that repeat the same phrase over and over again, or the word red rum spelled out on the door. Even Jack Nicholson's crazy face sticking through the door as he says the famous quote, "Here's Johnny." You'll leave this movie with these images just burned into your mind. I don't know too many movies that can do that as effectively as this one did. In the end, it's truly a downright scary experience, and that is why it is my #1 Stephen King horror movie.